Okay, so we're picking up with our discussion of the three main fields of philosophy: metaphysics, the study of reality; epistemology, the study of knowledge and belief; and axiology, the study of values, in such areas as aesthetics, having to do with beauty; economics, ethics, values about action, right and wrong; economics, values of goods and services, and so on. All right, so now we're going to have a sample puzzle. One of the major distinctions in metaphysics and axiology has to do with whether or not something is subjective, mostly in the mind or dependent on the mind or the senses, or objective, a feature of the object itself, or something that exists independently of the mind. Right? So I have a sample puzzle, which I'm going to discuss with you, and it's about a lemon. So the characteristics of a lemon, are they subjective, objective, or intersubjective? If you recall, intersubjective means subjective, but everyone with the same kind of mind or the same sensory equipment would perceive it the same way. Right? Okay, so different characteristics. Some might be in one category or the other. What about the tartness and sour, the tart, sour, and sweet experience with a lemon? Is that subjective or objective? Seems most intuitively to be subjective, and yet maybe an element of it intersubjective, because I think all human beings with creatures with tongues like ours, would experience it as having that tart-sweet blend. But what makes it tart and sweet is the citric acid, and that seems to be objective. When we can see that under a microscope, right? So citric acid being in the lemon, well, that lemons have citric acid in them, and sugar, some kind of sugar, I forget which kind, that seems to be an objective feature of the lemon. But the sweetness and tart, that's how those chemicals affect our tongue and our consciousness. Some other species might experience that differently for different reasons, right? But notice this subjective and intersubjective thing. It's a little fuzzy, right? You might like lemons, and someone might dislike them. I don't like that tart taste. It's that, right? So that's totally subjective, right? Because some of us like it and some of us don't. But if we all taste the sweetness and the tartness, right, it's not necessarily in the object, because sweet or tart has to do with taste, which is an extension of the mind, the tongue. So that makes it subjective. But if we all taste the tartness, then it's intersubjective, and at least among communities of minds that have tongues like ours, right? What about the oval shape of the lemon, right? Is that objective? Is that a feature of the lemon? Or a feature of the mind and of the eyes or something like that? Well, Aristotle made an interesting proposal. He said that if you can detect a characteristic of a thing through the use of more than one of your sense organs, then the characteristic that you detect seems to be more a property of the object than a property or an accident or a distortion based on your senses. If it's only one sense, there's no check on it. But if there are two senses, then that seems to be a check. Each one sense is a check on the other. So you can feel the shape, and you could also see it, and the size as well. So shape and size seem to be objective features, right? What about yellow? The theory of common sense, we call it common sense realism or naive realism, metaphysicians like to call that the common sense view, is that lemons are yellow. In fact, all objects in the world that seem to have colors do have color, that the world is colored. The colors are features of reality. They're objective. Lemons are yellow and strawberries are red, and so on. And grass is green and snow is white, right? But this might not necessarily be the case, right? The prism, the triangular or pyramid-like sheet of glass takes white light that comes into it. We'll do it like this, or it doesn't matter. White light comes through this side. When it goes through the top, the distance between this side and this side, near the top, is shorter than the distance at the bottom, which is wider, right? So there's something like that that diffuses the single ray of light that comes in, right? The different wavelengths, right? They get distributed, and then you get the colors of the rainbow. Right? And that's clouds do something prism-like, the amount of density of liquid in the cloud. Right? There are no rainbows. I mean, it's a kind of visual illusion. Right? So each different wavelength is correlated with a different color in our experience. Right? But really what they are is just wavelengths. Sort of like, by analogy, the classical metaphysical question: if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? I think the answer I'm shooting for in this analysis right now is that it makes a vibration. And just like taste is a feature of tongues, sound is a feature of ears. Right? Vibrations, when they hit the ear, cause sound experiences in the brain. The nerve from the eardrum that goes through the channels into the brain creates a sound sensation in the mind. So sound is subjective, but vibration is objective. Same thing with color. So lemon technically absorbs all the vibrations that cause every other color. They go into it. It has all of them in it. It's a collection of all of those, right, that penetrate through the surface, which is porous, the space between the atoms, right? So all that other radiation from the rainbow, that white beam of white light, gets pulled into the lemon, and the lemon reflects just what causes yellow when it hits your eyes. So the lemon is really technically almost got everything in it except yellow, right? So lemon is like all non-yellow, right? And what it reflects is what it doesn't take in, bounces off of it, hits your eye, and causes a yellow sensation in your brain. So colored light, it's almost two different things. Light is like vibration, and sound, right? Color is like sound in the mind. There's vibration outside the ear. There's sound inside the mind. There's color hitting the eye. The electrochemical signals through the optic nerve create color sensations in the mind. Okay? So it's a kind of representation. And then where those vibrations are coming from, like from the lemon over here, let's just say, the mind projects yellow experience in that direction so that you can identify that, right, and differentiate it from other things in the environment. The way that bats or sonograms work, with sound vibrations, the sound is coming back when the echo hits this object over here, and I hear it, it comes back, and then I know that there's something there. Right? This is a kind of creation. A visual image might even be created in a bat's mind, like in a sonogram. Vibrations show an image of a fetus on the screen when the woman's belly is being checked, during pregnancy. Okay? But there's also the color inversion problem, as we like to call it. Suppose you and your identical twin, right, exactly the same brain, perceive a strawberry, the same strawberry from the same angle. Oh, well, that might be impossible, but from a multitude of angles, you each examine it, and any other red thing, let's just say. Your twin might be experiencing something that doesn't seem red to you. What's red in your mind, since it's completely in your mind, the color sensation, his might be something like orange or purple. Right? But as long as both of you were raised to call strawberries red and apples red and blood red and so on and so forth, there'll never be a way of detecting that someone else's experience inside their head is different from yours, because we've been taught public use of language for objects that cause reliable sensations for each individual. It doesn't mean the sensations are the same. Right? How do you know someone else's experience is the same as yours, even when it appears to be intersubjective? Because we all say, oh yes, tart, 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 right? But it might be completely subjective. It might not be. I mean, if we can call it tart, there's some intersubjective element to it, but privately, it might not be intersubjective. It might be radically individualistic relative to the individual. We don't know. Okay? All right, so that was just a sample problem to show that, The properties of a lemon, are they subjective, objective, or intersubjective? Right? So now I want to go back and dive a little more deeply into epistemology, the study of knowledge, belief, and I like to say, and related informational states. Because it might be the case that a computer program could somehow or another embody knowledge, right? Artificial intelligence, that sort of thing, without having consciousness at all. Some neuroscientists don't think that our consciousness does any work anyway, in which case we're already, functionally identical to a computer program. All right, so we want to know when, like, this is a question that your English teachers might want you to understand about reliable information on the internet. When is information reliable, right? You look something up, and a lot of the things that come up are unreliable sources of information, right? So that's a question about knowledge. What's the difference between information and knowledge? Well, belief, things that we think are true, and knowledge, right? Well, first of all, let's talk about this. What is a belief? The beliefs are primary in philosophy, at least in Western philosophy. What is a belief? Right? Well, a belief might be many different things. It might be something that you think is true. I think that's really the most minimal conception of belief that holds true for almost every kind of belief. Although there may be problems with that. Some people say, I believe it, right? But really, they don't. It's a matter of faith. And if really when you say, I believe it, what you mean in your heart is, I hope it's true, or I want it to be true. I'm trying to make myself think it's true. But if you don't really think that it's true, then maybe it's not really a belief in the sense of belief, which is a thought or statement that I think is true. Right? So that's problematic there, but I want to set that aside and say that at least ideally, or I'm going to define belief in one sense. There may be other senses, right? But I think a kind of really good starting point for belief is when you say, I believe X, you're at least trying to say, I think X is true. Well, P. And philosophers like to use the letter P. Mathematicians start with X for a variable. 2 plus X equals Y, or 2 plus X equals 5. If you have that information, you can tell X is 3. If it's 2 plus X equals Y, you can't tell, right? But with propositions, statements, claims, someone who proposes something like the moon is made out of cheese, that's a proposition, it's a statement, it's a claim, right? It might be a belief if you think it's true, right? So it's a thought, P. P could stand for any statement, like the moon is made out of cheese, the cat is on the mat, today is Wednesday. Right? We use the letter P as a variable for any proposition or claim statement, right? Like X in that only applies to claim statements, thoughts. So a belief would be, I think, like if so-and-so believes P, Frank believes that P, P stands for the cat is on the mat or whatever, right? Frank thinks that P is true. That would be my minimal definition, right? Belief that P equals or means the thought that P is true, right? This might not, like I said, it might not apply in the case of that belief-like category called faith. We might sometimes say we believe something, right? We want when it's really the case that we want to believe it, right? So, a friend of mine, former professor Jonathan Adler of Brooklyn College, wrote a book about the ethics of belief. I forget the exact title, but he argued very strongly that real belief has to be something like that, something that you think is true. In which case, we frequently trick ourselves and say that we believe things when it's that we want to believe them. All right, but we'll leave that aside. Okay, there may be special kinds of belief. It doesn't matter. So for now, that'll be our basic definition. Right, for belief, something that you think is true. All right. So what does belief do? Now remember we talked about light coming into the eyes and causing color sensations, vibrations coming into the ear, creating sounds. And then in our mind, we take that information and we formulate an image in our mind, right, of like a cat on the mat who's meowing, let's just say, and it's a black cat. right? So we've got color and sound, and it's coming from a certain place. You get an image in the mind of a cat on a mat meowing, and so it's sort of like information you could even imagine going into a computer that represents an image. If a computer had just senses, like something that put cameras and audio recorders and good programming that replicated the brain, right, it could create an image of a cat on a mat meowing. And you could see that on the monitor and hear it from the speakers. Same thing going on in the mind. There's a cat on the mat image in the mind, and you hear a meow. Most of that is in your head, but it's caused by stuff outside of your head, picked up by your senses. Right? An image is formed in your mind. A way of thinking about the mind in that regard is as a mirror. Right? So if your mind and senses are working, right, you might imagine that when you aim your mind at the world, you're aiming a kind of mirror that's going to reflect the way the world is outside of your mind, in your mind, on that picture. Okay. Computer monitor mirror in your mind, right? That represents, right, what's presented to your senses from the world. It gets represented or represented as an image in your mind. The mind as a mirror. You aim the mind at reality, and reality is reflected in your mind the way you aim a mirror at something. The image of the thing that it's aimed at reflects on the mirror, right? Mind as a mirror. Right? So if a belief is a thought that you think is true, right, then the thought is a representation of the world or some feature of the world, and you think that your equipment is functioning, so and if the world, your perceptions cause this belief, and you think that it's true. Right? Your mind is working as a mirror. So thought is a picture in the mind. Some of them is just our imagination or dreams and things like that, or thoughts in our mind, but we might not think that they're true. Right? We're just wondering or imagining or being creative, or we're dreaming or daydreaming. But a belief is an image in the mind that you think is caused by the world outside. It reflects reality in some way. Right? So truth, when you say a thought that you think is true, some of your thoughts you don't think they're true, is true means the image in your mind reflects reality. So truth is some kind of a relation between thoughts or representations in your mind and reality outside the mind. Subjective and objective correlation or correspondence or mapping is some kind of connection. Right? That's what belief is in some kind of sense. Right? Correspondence, relationship between thought and reality. A matching relationship, a mirroring, mind as mirror, representing, representing. The thought represents. So if it's true, it adequately or correctly represents the world, like a map represents the actual roads and mountains and so on, where the hospital is on a map. If it accurately corresponds with reality, the map is true in some sense, right? Okay, so a true belief depicts reality as it is, correctly, right? Not all beliefs do. Sometimes we have false beliefs. We think it's true, but it's not. So the question, one of the key questions for individuals who want to be philosophically alive is, are my beliefs true? Is the process that generates my beliefs, is it processing function? Is that process functioning? Is it working? Right? Is my belief process functioning well? So I like to make an analogy between the belief forming process and a weather vane. The weather vane is that arrow kind of, it looks like a crucifix on top of a roof. Could be a rooster, it doesn't matter what the image is. And the wind hits it and it blows and it indicates the direction of the wind. That's what a weather vane is, right? The purpose of a weather vane is to detect and respond to and therefore indicate the direction of the wind. Right? That's what it does when it's functioning well. When it malfunctions, right, it indicates a direction that used to be true. The wind, it indicates the direction where the wind was the last time it was working. Just like a frozen clock that says 3 o'clock. It doesn't work anymore, right? It was 3 o'clock, like the last time it worked, right? Unless it slowed down before it froze, right? But you get the idea. It falsely indicates the time. It indicates a time that's not really responsive. It's not responding the right way. It's not functioning, right? The weather vane. When it's what makes it not work? Maybe it's frozen. It's so cold out it won't move, or it's rusted, or something else like that, or something's blocking it, something fell into the mechanism that's blocking it from turning, or you may or may not see that thing. Or maybe somebody put a glass dome over it, right? So that the wind doesn't penetrate the glass. Right? There's all kinds of ways in which a weather vane might fail to work. Right? So in the same way that a weather vane, the purpose of it is to indicate the direction of the wind. What is belief for? What's the purpose of belief? To indicate reality, to indicate the world, to indicate the truth. What, picture of the world, what's going on. It's like a map of reality in your head. It shows you the world when you look at the world. Right? That's what's supposed to happen anyway when your belief process is functioning. Right? When it's malfunctioning, it's like a frozen weather vane or a frozen clock. Right? It indicates something that might have been true at some point, but it's not true now. Right? It's like maybe an old map, or maybe a GPS, a cheap GPS system that doesn't get updates about weather and traffic rather, or new streets that have been built or whatever. Maybe a corny old model, right? So maybe your beliefs could be like that, right? What causes the weather vane to malfunction? Rust, putting glass over it. Same thing. What causes a belief-forming mechanism, the belief process, to malfunction? I think primarily two things. Being cut off from the evidence, like in the case of the weather vane, the wind is the evidence, so that glass dome cuts the weather vane off from the evidence, from the wind. So similarly, if you're cut off from gathering in new information, or you stop gathering information, not for whatever reason, you're tired of gathering information, or you're, whatever reason, or maybe you think you have all the information that you need, right? If you think you know everything, then you don't pay attention to new evidence, new data, new testimony, new claims, news, updates, changes, discoveries, right? New data, new information, right? If you're cut off from either, or you're not paying attention, you're not using your own senses, right? And part of what our senses is what we can read, and studies that we can see of what other expert witnesses have observed, right? So there's observation in the broadest sense, which means observing or paying attention to information in the world, right? And then reasoning about it. You might have the information coming in, but you're not reasoning about it, right? When scientists perform experiments, they don't just look at the data. They reason about it and examine it and try to figure out what picture it shows, right? What's true? What's going on? What explains this data? You have data, and then you have theory. What would be the best explanation for all the observations that we have? Oh, this is causing that. Because we know when we remove this, that stops happening. When we interject it, that starts happening. Just for an example. That's an example of how you need to use reasoning in addition to observation. So with the weather vane, when it's working, there's wind blowing, and you have access to it, and the mechanism can move around in response to the wind and indicate it. With beliefs, there's information and inference, or reasoning. We just might want to just say reason and observation, or logic and information. Same thing, right? And both of those have to be working. Logical thinking and information coming in, receptive to information and logical thinking about it. If either one or both of those are limited in some way, if not in a major way, then that's how beliefs stop doing what they're supposed to do, which is adequately like the mirror reflecting the world. Okay? So is your belief vane, or your truth vane, or your reality vane frozen, rusted, right? The Tin Man needs the oil can in The Wizard of Oz. Oil can? He needs to be oiled, right? Same thing with the weather vane. It might need to be oiled, or wipe the rust off. Now, how do you oil the belief vane? The truth or reality vane, your mind? Well, by paying attention, right? A functioning belief vane, you might want to say, has the following characteristics. If a proposition or a statement is true, this is just like kind of a summary way of looking at it, right? Like if some statement is true, right? If your belief vane is working and you have information about it, right, and your reasoning is working, then you will believe that it's true, right? If adequate information has been presented to you that indicates that a proposition is true, then you will believe it. You'll think it's true, right? If adequate information has been given to you that indicates that that belief is false, then you won't believe it. right? Sometimes we have direct access to the truth. For instance, if early on in a movie you might think, oh, this is what's going to happen. And then later on it happens. You go, I knew it, right? So you thought it was going to happen, and it did happen. So you had a belief, you thought something was true, and it turned out to be true. Right? But before it turned out to be true, you didn't know. You only had, you might not even know afterwards. You might know afterwards, but you might not have. Just because you had a right belief doesn't mean you knew all along, right? Because it could have turned out otherwise. So true belief is no guarantee of knowledge, right? But early on in the movie, you only had information and evidence and reason, but you didn't know. You didn't have direct access to the truth until after the fact. You go, oh, that turned out. When the movie's over, it's obvious what happened, right? So when you have access to the truth, then the first two things that I said about your weather vane working apply. Like, if the proposition is true, then you believe it. If the proposition is false, then you don't believe it, right? If those two if-then statements apply to your belief mechanism, that's a good sign that you know it's functioning, right? Because sometimes we're presented with true statements, but we don't believe them. We're presented with false statements, and we continue to believe them. That sort of thing, right? So that would be a way in which your belief-forming mechanism isn't working. But like later on in the movie, we do have access to the truth, right? But sometimes we don't have access like earlier on in the movie. We just have information and patterns and reasoning. So another way of seeing if your belief process or your mental weather vane is functioning is this. If the best evidence suggests that the proposition is true, then you're likely to believe it. If the best evidence implies that the proposition is false, then you're likely to not believe it, right? So if that's true, if those two principles apply to you, and then the other two, all four, then you're probably a pretty good believer. You know, epistemology, check for you. All right? So now, that's the background for the discussion of Clifford's article about the ethics of belief. And we're going to pause here so that we could upload this video without it being a little too bulky to upload. And then part 3, we'll talk about Clifford, the ethics of the belief. This is part 2.